Hey friends, it's Laura with Laura's Handmade Haven. Welcome and welcome back. I'm so glad you joined me today. We have all 6 of our blocks for the Mercantile Quilt Seeds packets done, and it is time to put them into a quilt top. This is such an exciting day. So the thing is, I looked at my space and I looked at the size of these blocks and they're too big. So I need to either cut down the blocks or do something to adjust the size of them. And so I'm going to share with you what I'm going to do, because I measured my space and I have about 56 inches, and these will be 58 without the outer border that they suggest you putting on it to finish the quilt. So I am going to leave the outer border off, and I'm going to decrease the size of the blocks just a smidge. So in order to do that, when I get them to the machine, well, I'll explain when we get to the machine. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab them down off the design board, head on over to the sewing machine, and explain to you what I'm going to do. Okay, so this is one of those things that I kind of hesitate mentioning that I'm going to do, because I know that there are some of you out there that are going to kind of judge me over this. But here's the deal. We could take these blocks to the cutting mat and we could trim them all down. The outside borders, we could trim them off. And I would need to lose about a half of an inch or about a quarter of an inch, I guess. Yeah, in order to make this work. Or I can do what I'm going to do, and I'm just going to adjust my seam width, and then I'll trim the seams. So what I've done is I'm using a magnetic little seam guide over here that's on my sewing machine, and I set that at the 1/2 inch mark. So that gives me an extra quarter of an inch, an extra half of an inch off the width and the length of these blocks. So that's going to adjust enough for what I need to do to get it to fit my space. All right, so I'm basically just going to sew these together. And I'm leaving that seam guide there just so, well, one, so I don't forget. And so I know that it's a good 1/2 inch, and I'm not wiggling back and forth on that. A quarter of an inch, I'm good at keeping that with the side of my pressure foot. At 1/2 inch, sometimes that's hard to keep correct when you're going this length. Now I'm going to grab the top 2 blocks for the second column of this quilt and bring them over to the machine and do the same thing. Now I'm going to go grab the bottom block for the first column and put it onto here. Since I'm not putting an outer border on this quilt, you may have noticed that I'm back stitching at the beginning and end of each of these blocks, and that's because those are going to be outside seams on my quilt top, and I don't want those to come apart, so I do a little back stitch just to make sure that's locked into place. Okay, now that I have my 2 columns done, I will be sewing them together. Let's see. Let's move you back a little bit. Okay, so this is my left column, and this is the top. And then the one on my lap is my right column. So I just need to take it and flip it over. And then again, we're going to do that same 1/2 inch seam going this way. And because all of them were sewn together with the same seam allowance, they're going to match up. Now I could go ahead and trim those seams a little bit before I did this, but it'll be okay. I'll just be careful and I'll trim them with scissors. And again, I'm doing a little back stitch just because that's going to be on that outside edge. So when I put on the long arm, I don't want to take a risk of it coming apart on me. So I'm just going to do a little back stitch there to lock it in place. Now the other thing that you may have noticed that I just did, I clipped this, and this is where those two blocks meet. So I just clipped this so I know that is where I need to make sure they line up. I'm going to remove the clip and replace that placement with my finger. I'm going to stop right on that seam. And I'm going to do the same thing for the next two blocks when I get them found. Let's see, here we go. So I'm going to take these and I'm just nesting these seams together and putting a clip there to hold it in place. And this just kind of keeps my blocks aligned as I move down the quilt top. Now you could definitely take this and pin it and then pin the entire length, and it would be very precise and great, and you'd be very happy with the results. I'm just not a pinner, so I found this works okay. Again, I'll remove the clip and just pinch it with my fingers and stop right on that seam. And now this is the last one. And now this one, I don't have any more intersections, right? So I'm just going to take my little clip and clip it right here, pretty close to the bottom of the block where these two outside sashing borders, or whatever you want to call them, the little sashing pieces come into play. Now remember, when I get to the end, I'll do a little back stitch just to lock those in place. All right. Now, since I did a 1/2 inch seam allowance, not a 1/4 inch, I'm going to take my scissors and I'll trim it. I'll trim all the seams down. Now this one, I could do this one with my rotary cutter with no issue whatsoever. The ones going across, since I didn't trim them before I did the columns, I'll need to do those with my scissors, because when you get to this, when you get to these intersections here, you definitely run the risk of cutting the wrong part of your fabric off. So just keep that in mind. But I know that as quilters, we like strive for that perfect 1/4 inch seam, and we get so hung up on making sure it's a 1/4 inch, a 1/4 inch all the time. But what we need to keep in mind is that as long as your seam allowance is consistent, it's gonna line up. Now your finished block size will be affected, and it won't be the same as what the pattern calls for. But if you take any pattern and instead of a 1/4 inch, you did 3/8 of an inch, as long as you're consistent with that same seam allowance for the entire block and the entire quilt, it's going to line up. It's going to be precise, but it's not going to be the pattern finished size. It's going to be smaller because you're taking out extra fabric for each one. Now in this case, I did that on purpose because my wall is not wide enough. The space is not wide enough to hang the quilt. So instead of cutting down each one of my individual blocks, I decided I'll just adjust my seam allowance to get that extra out of it. And then when it's all together, it will be the right size for my space. Not the right size that they intended in the pattern for a finished quilt size, but it works for me. Okay, so I'm going to trim all my seams and then I'll get it back up on the design wall and I will do a reveal. You know what? In fact, I'll show you a little of the seam trimming, but you get the general idea, right? You take a ruler and you rotary cutter and you cut it. Now I'm going to be super careful with this because I don't want to cut anything that I don't want to cut. I'm only going to be using an 18-inch ruler just because that's what I'm comfortable with. And then I'm just lining this up. I'm lining the 1/4 inch marking on my ruler on my seam. And I'm just going to cut that off and I'll work my way down the quilt. Now make sure that your quilt top is laying super flat but nothing is bunched up. You don't want any of your fabric bunched up underneath that outside of that seam where you're cutting it off, because then you'd be cutting into your quilt top, and that's not what we're going for. Okay, so then for these cross seams, since I didn't trim them before I sewed the 2 columns together, which honestly I should have done, but I just didn't. What I'm going to do is I'll lay this out the other direction and find where those seams are, and then I'll just use my scissors to carefully cut some of that excess fabric off. And the reason you want to do that is because you don't want that extra bulk when you go to quilt the quilt. You want to have some of that out of there. And then on this intersection, I'm just going to kind of angle it out. And then we'll go to the other side, angle it in, and again, just cut some of that excess off. And I know that you probably cannot see where my seam is. I can see where my seam is though, and that's really what matters. But trust me, I'm just, I'm taking some of it off. It's probably not an exact 1/4 inch, but it's pretty close. So I have 2 more of these cross seams to do for the other 2 blocks down here, and then we will reveal our quilt top. Here's our finished Mercantile Quilt Seeds quilt top. Obviously it's not quilted yet, but all the blocks are together, even with that adjusted seam allowance. So it's going to fit my space perfectly. I'm super excited to get this quilted and up on the wall. Probably going to be a little bit before that happens, but it'll get done when it gets done. But for now, I love it. I love it so much. So I can't even tell you, I'm not really even sure which one to tell you is my favorite block. I definitely have a special place in my heart for the sewing machine block, just because it's a sewing machine block, right? But I love all of them. I love the pin cushions. I love this little jar. I love the star block. This is such amazing. I love this. It's an amazing design. It's got such pretty little tulips basically in the corners. I really liked doing the scissors blocks because they were super fun and definitely a different shape than I had done before in a piece block. But this really shows you how creative you can get with your piecing and how many different designs you can get into such a small space. You can just take some fabric and thread and make such a really cool looking quilt. So we have a quilt top. We have completed the Mercantile Quilt Seeds patterns. I have enjoyed it so much. I am so thankful my husband got the kits for me. I love him so much. He's an amazing guy. And he just knows I love quilting and I love doing this. And I love sharing this with you guys. And he actually was like, I felt like this might be something you would want to do. So yeah, I'm so glad that it's together and I'm so excited to get it quilted and up on the wall. And thank you so much for following along with this sew along. I hope that if you had the patterns, you picked up some tips and tricks. I hope if you don't have the patterns that you still picked up some tips and tricks for other things you're working on, or maybe it inspired you to buy the patterns. It's such a cute quilt, right? It's such a cute quilt. Until next time, find joy in all you do. Carve out some time for crafting and creating. And remember, it's always better when you make stuff up.